So we have Andrew Lownie with us this evening, and if you've not seen his other work, he is a researcher extraordinaire on the Traitor King. We did have a podcast up with him, but on the great deplatforming, YouTube cited it as one of our infractions of cyberbullying. But he's back this evening to talk about his new book, The Traitor King. You did send me a slew of talking points. We've condensed them down. But would still love to get you back in the studio to do a longer version of what we're going to do this evening. But let's just start out with you introducing yourself, Andrew, to people who are not familiar with your work.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch the question. You want me to tell them about the book?
Could you just tell people who you are and your work? Just a little introduction to people who are not familiar with you.
Yeah, my name's Andrew Lownie. I've written several biographies, most recently a book on the Mountbattens. And my latest book is called Traitor King, The Scandalous Exile of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, which argues two things: that there wasn't the great love affair between Wallace and the Duke, that in fact she was emotionally blackmailed into marrying him and was desperately unhappy. And the two were Nazi sympathizers and actually intrigued with the Germans during the war against this country.
So are you getting blowback from these projects, Andrew, like I got blowback from interviewing you previously?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear that question.
Are you getting blowback from these projects?
I'm not. Well, the Palace hasn't commented, and the book hasn't had as much publicity as some of my previous books. So I think it's a story people really don't want to visit. There've been rumors about the involvement, and some of the books have touched on it, but no one has really looked at it systematically and gone to the archives, as I did. Archives not just in this country, which have been heavily weeded, but archives around the world. So I found fantastic stuff in France, Spain, Portugal, Germany, Russia, and particularly in the Bahamas, where there are a lot of British files which haven't been weeded.
So surely you're creating some enemies because you were campaigning for Mountbatten's unpublished works to be published, and that's been censored, hasn't it? What's the status on that?
Well, the status is that there's a hearing on the 15th of November where the whole thing will be discussed. This is the hearing to deal with the appeal that the Cabinet Office made when we had the judgment in our favor for them to be disclosed in 2019. But there's been a lot of parliamentary media pressure. I've actually got a meeting with the Parliamentary Archives Committee tomorrow to talk about the fact that these diaries have been still held back. Some material has been released, but there's still some to get released.
So we have a lot of young people watching our videos. Could you explain who the Traitor King was?
Well, the Traitor King was Edward VIII. And when he was being brought back to Britain from exile on the continent in 1940, he was you could say, the victim of an entrapment by the Germans, who were trying to persuade him to take on the role of British equivalent of Marshal Pétain. I think he actively intrigued with the Germans. They were actually sending his maid up to collect stuff from his home in Paris when it was occupied by the Germans. And we have quite a lot of now coded messages, which were discovered after the war from captured German documents, showing the degree of his commitment and involvement, and that he was communicating with the enemy in code during war, saying that he was prepared to come back as a puppet king.
And what motivated him to do that?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear that.
What was his motivation to sell the country out?
Well, I think his motivation was that he felt he had a place on the world stage. He felt he perhaps had given it up too easily. He was being pushed by Wallace. He wanted to influence her. And he was very pro-German. He believed in the Führer principle. He had met Hitler in 1937, had tea with him. He had done a tour of Germany and seen all the Nazi leaders, and he approved of what they were doing. And he felt the battle really was with communism, and that Britain and the Anglo-Saxon nations were very much should work with Germany, and that they shouldn't be going to war.
So Wallace was married, wasn't she? How did this relationship with the traitor king come about?
Yes, Wallace had two previous husbands. I mean, that was one of the problems about her marrying him. But I think that she was really a pretext for getting rid of him. There was concern among government circles that he was too pro-German, he was too prepared to go outside his constitutional role, and that he needed to be basically taken away. And Wallace helped in their maneuvering to basically get him off the throne. In fact, when he was in Spain in 1940, there was even a man called Peter Russell who was sent to shoot him if necessary if he went across to the Germans. And in some ways, I'm surprised that there weren't other attempts on his life, because he was seen to be very much a loose cannon from about 1935 onwards.
Was he a bit of a partier?
Was he a bit of a party animal, do you say?
Yeah.
Well, he loved, I mean, he spent his life in exile basically going to parties and giving parties, and he enjoyed cafe society. I mean, he wasn't really given a job to do, so that's how he spent his time. And he mixed with all sorts of people: Ernest Hemingway, Maria Callas, Cecil Beaton, a lot of Hollywood film stars and film producers. He lived very extravagantly. He had liveried servants and very smart homes. His house in the south of France is now owned by Roman Abramovich. So he was able to entertain in style, and people liked, of course, to have the contact with the former king.
Who were his parents?
Well, his parents were George V and Queen Mary, and he had very sort of emotionally barren youth. I think that's part of the problem. George V was a bully. He had great expectations of his son, and yet even on his deathbed, he said that boy will ruin himself within a year. So he didn't really have confidence in him. Queen Mary was a very cold figure, and in some ways, his relationships with women all his life were about trying to win or trying to have a mother relationship with these women. He spoke in baby talk. He never really grew up. And Wallace was a very dominant figure, very hard figure. And in some ways, the more unpleasant she was to him, the more he liked it. He was a sort of dom relationship.
What was the blackmail plot revealed in the book?
So what blackmail plot?
Yeah, there was on pages 61 to 63, there was a blackmail plot.
Was he susceptible to blackmail? Well, he was certainly, when I discovered, both of them were bisexual, and he had relationships, for example, with Walter Chrysler, who was the son of the man who founded the car firm. So yeah, he was vulnerable to blackmail, but that sort of didn't really come out until quite recently. A man called Scotty Bowers, who was a sort of procurer for the stars in Hollywood, wrote a book and had a chapter devoted to the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. But he was an embarrassment, certainly. The government tried to play down his involvement with the Nazis. And indeed, when these captured German documents appeared in 1945, they tried to have them destroyed. And it was only the American historians who insisted that they should be preserved that meant that they actually have survived and actually been made public.
So during his philandering then, did he sow illegitimate children?
Well, there are lots of stories of illegitimate children. I found a man called Tim Seeley, who's still alive, who's an actor, who was the son of one of his girlfriend's sisters, a woman called Frida Ward. So that man is certainly, or members of his family say that he and his sister were both actually the children of the Duke of Windsor, born in 1935, so actually when he was with Wallace. And that, in fact, lawyers came to see him after the Duke died to sort out an inheritance. There's also a woman called Edwina Drummond, who was the daughter of, again, close friends of his, and she went off to live in Ireland. Again, there was a very strong family resemblance. There have been other candidates over the years, mainly from a much earlier period in his life, from the sort of First World War. But those two are from the slightly later period. But so many of his papers are still closed or have been destroyed that I think a lot of these stories will just never know the truth.
And is there generally, are they ostracized then, illegitimate children from the main royals?
Were the children ostracized?
Yeah.
No, I think it was all kept very quiet. I mean, of course, no one really knew about these stories until quite recently. So there may have been rumors within society, but they certainly weren't ostracized. He certainly showed interest in them. One of them, this chap Tim Seeley, the sister was a godchild, and so he had a reason to stay in touch with the family and to give them gifts.
What about the contacts with Bideau?
The contacts with Charles Beddoe.
Yes.
Yeah, well, Charles Beddoe was the man who lent him his castle for his wedding, who was a German agent, and he was the man who organized the tour to Germany. And it's really through Charles Beddoe, I think, that the Duke possibly betrayed the French defenses to the Germans in 1940, whether deliberately or inadvertently, because he'd been given a job to inspect the defenses. He did a report on it, which he gave to the British, but he also, for some strange reason, gave the details to Charles Beddoe, and Charles Beddoe passed them on to the Germans.
How many people died because of that, do you estimate?
Sorry, I haven't heard that question.
How many people would have died because of leaking that information, could you estimate?
How many people have died as a result of his involvement? Well, it's very difficult to quantify, but clearly, if he betrayed the plans so that the Germans changed their plans and they came around the side of the Maginot Line and were able to invade France very quickly, then he's got the blood of the whole of the invasion of France on his hands. There must be other episodes where he betrayed confidences or material that he had access to. Very hard to quantify, but he's certainly got blood on his hands.
What about the attempt to form a peace party?
Well, this is an extraordinary thing that even after the beginning of the war in January 1940, he came back to Britain to set up a peace party with Beaverbrook. And there was some support in government. There was a worry that Britain really wasn't prepared for war. And the extraordinary thing I discovered was there were negotiations and overtures going on really throughout the 1940, even as late as 1941. And even Churchill was letting some of these discussions run just to see what happened. But they came through the Vatican, through Switzerland, and various Sweden. And he was certainly very involved, as were a lot of the people he was close to. There's another man called Axel Wenner-Gren, a Swedish industrialist, who was also involved in these peace moves.
Wow. Okay. What was his involvement in this?
Well, Churchill had been a great supporter of the Duke. He'd been actually during the abdication. But when he became prime minister, he began to get fed up with the way the Duke was behaved. He was very petulant. He wouldn't come back to Britain. He was holding on for particular concessions. He wanted his title for Wallace. He wanted to be given a proper job. He wanted to be entertained by the family. And Churchill got so fed up, and I think he must have been aware of the treachery, that at one point he threatened him with court-martial. And then he arranged for him to go as governor to the Bahamas to get him out of harm's way. But later on, after the war, he took so against the Duke that he refused to actually go when he was invited on a cruise on the same yacht by Onassis. He refused to go because the Duke would be there.
Right. And then you had the German cooperation with Windsor.
Sorry, we have the German
cooperation with Windsor.
Yes, I mean the Germans. He certainly took advantage. They took advantage of him, and so, as I say, he was able to send his maid to Paris to pick up linen he needed for the Bahamas. He had a lot of contact with the Germans. He didn't report any of the approaches from the Germans, and he must have been very aware that these approaches, were frankly treacherous. But he was being monitored. He was being bugged by MI5. The FBI were keeping an eye on him. And later in his life, he was under surveillance from the French Secret Service. So there were lots of people keeping an eye on him and were quite aware of what he was up to.
What locations were bugged?
What locations are we talking about? Well, the Operation Willy plot takes place in Spain and Portugal in 1940, but he's lives half the time in Paris and south of France, and the other half the time in the States, where he has a flat in New York. So that's really the center of activities. But he was always going, for example, on cruises around the Mediterranean or the Caribbean. clearly there's his period as governor of the Bahamas during the war, which of course is the period when he tries to cover up the Harry Oakes murder, because he was involved himself in some financial irregularities with some of the people, including Harry Oakes. So scandal really followed him everywhere. And he was dealing with black currency dealings even in the post-war period. At one point, his secretary was going to take the story to the press and he had to be bought off and sacked.
So did MI5, MI6 bug those locations?
Sorry, it's not a very clear line.
Yeah, the spying, the bugging, was that done in his various locations by MI5, MI6?
Yes, he was bugged by the FBI whenever he went to the States. He had a police protection officer with him always, and he reported back to the royal household and to Scotland Yard. His telephone, certainly when he was in Britain before he was the abdication, his telephone conversations were bugged, and his mail was opened. He was under surveillance. There was postal censorship during the war in the Bahamas, and so his mail was intercepted there, or rather Wallace's mail. So yeah, they had a pretty good idea of what was going on in his life. I mean, he actually got rather paranoid about it, and actually made reference to it at one dinner.
What about the Lisbon Records?
Well, the Lisbon files are pretty good. They have the records of the Portuguese Secret Service surveillance reports that were done in June, July of 1940. So we have quite a lot of evidence there, again, about his dealings with the Germans, on top of these captured German documents, which have all the telegrams between the German ambassadors in Lisbon and in Madrid, with Ribbentrop and the German Foreign Ministry. So there's quite a lot of archival material to support the accusations of treachery.
Who was Santo?
There was a man called Espirito de Santo, who was a Portuguese banker, actually ran the biggest bank in Portugal, and his role was as a sort of banker to the Nazis. And the Duke actually stayed in his house when he was there in that summer. And Santo was the German agent who was in some ways the coordinating figure for this Operation Willy.
Do you know anything about, was it Prescott Bush being involved with this stuff around this time, the business dealings with the Nazis?
Well, I've not come across Prescott Bush, but I mean, certainly Windsor was very much involved with Mooney of General Motors, and other organizations that were trading with the enemy. So it wouldn't be surprising if he was connected. And he was bankrolled by James Mooney of General Motors. He was also, I think, with a number of these businessmen, like Axel Wenner-Gren, who sort of thought business came first and politics second. He was keen, for example, to get rich schemes in Mexico, in which some of these people were involved. So that wouldn't surprise me.
Have you read his coded telegram to the Germans?
No, we've not seen his telegram. We've seen the telegram that was sent by Santo to Berlin, confirming that he had been in touch. I suspect that telegram was part of the captured German documents, but was destroyed or has been kept secret. But we have enough evidence from Guy Liddell, who's an MI5 officer, and from Alan Lascelles, who was the private secretary to the monarch, who confirmed the existence of the coded telegram, that we know it existed.
Have you read the FBI files?
Yes, quite a lot of the FBI files have been released, and they relate, for example, that Wallace had supposedly an affair with Ribbentrop. There's a man called Father Odo, who was a cousin of the Duke, who came and gave them stories. But I suspect there are many more files, either have been destroyed or are still closed, because there was very extensive surveillance over a long period of time. In fact, there's a story in one of the FBI files of a woman trying to blackmail him. This is perhaps what you were referring to. A former lover of his called Rhoda Doubleday, who was basically trying to blackmail him because of his relationship with her before he married Wallace.
You're saying that he was having a sexual relationship with one of Hitler's top men, Ribbentrop?
Yes, Wallace was supposedly slept with him 17 times, and that's why he sent her 17 carnations a day. But they were certainly, even if they weren't physically intimate, they were very close. She met him a number of times, and in fact, he was sent to London as ambassador to get close to her. There was also a German agent called Stephanie von Hollenhau, who took the flat next to her in Bryanston Court, who was sent to target her because they felt that Wallace was the easiest way into the Duke. And she also, of course, had pro-German views.
What's come out in the MI5 file just released?
Well, we know there is an MI5 file, but it was destroyed at the end of the war. So we've never seen the MI5 files. I've seen the French Secret Service files, which are in the archives in Paris. And they recount, for example, Wallace's lover, Jimmy Donahue, how he would stay overnight. But unfortunately, the MI5 material was destroyed.
What about the secret documents at Cronberg?
Yes, that's an extraordinary story. At the end of the war, Anthony Blunt was sent to recover embarrassing correspondence between the Duke and his German cousins, and particularly Philip of Hesse. This was always the argument that Blunt had been given immunity because he had this dirt on the royal family. And they've always denied it. But I found a diary in an Oxford college of a man who was posted to Cronberg, which was a German castle where a lot of these papers were kept, the home of the Hesse family, that shows that there was correspondence there between Hesse and the Duke of Windsor in one of the drawers. So I think probably this incriminating evidence was picked up in 1945 and brought back to the Royal Archives, where it remains to this day.
Who was the Duke in bisexual relationships with?
Well, the person that I name is a man called Walter Chrysler, who was a rich American philanthropist. But there were others. I mean, there were basically effect prostitutes that Scotty Bowers produced for him. There's also, I think, an actor called Clifton Webb. There's sort of love letters I found at an auction site. But I suspect there are other figures. Chips Channon, in his diary, talks about the homosexual relations, that he would go and pick up guardsmen from the Knightsbridge barracks. Nicky Haslam, who's still alive, talks about rumours in the gay community. So I suspect there were quite a lot of people, but we just haven't got the names.
Do you see any parallels with Mountbatten?
Yes, I think there are parallels with him and Mountbatten. The fact that they led these double lives, that they were protected, that they didn't seem too worried by it in some respects, the fact that they were open to blackmail, and that they were living this secret. And I think they just had this very strong sense of entitlement, that everyone would protect them and they'll be able to get away with it. Of course, there are very interesting parallels too with Harry and Meghan. It's the same story of a prince taken away to the States by an American divorcee, debates over finance and security, the curation of the story through tame journalists, the suing of papers, the falling out with brothers and sisters-in-law, the whole story, the exploitation of the royal brand. So in some ways, the history is repeating itself, 70 years later.
So did him and Wallace have a bizarre sex life?
Well, she certainly, was bisexual, and she certainly had a number of lovers, apart from this man, Jimmy Donahue, this one I think called Russell Knipe, who's a young actor. But there were stories about her wild time in China in the 1930s, when she had learnt all sorts of strange sexual techniques. And there was supposedly a file on her that MI5 had called the China dossier that various people had seen, and I've seen documents reporting them to have seen it and discussing it with others. But of course, that again has been destroyed or never been released. But yes, I mean, one of the arguments is that she was able to, in a sense, get the Duke around her, a little finger, really, because of her sexual techniques.
Wow. What is the royal family's attitude towards this now?
Well, I think they want to shut the story down. There's still a cover up. They're not commenting on the book. I suspect there will be attempts to discredit the book and its research, though it's extensively researched with extensive footnotes. So I don't know. I mean, in some ways, you would think that they come out of it quite well because they distance themselves from the Duke and Duchess because of their activities. They refuse to give them any sort of job or any sort of status. But I think it's a huge embarrassment. The Queen's uncle was a spy, or as a traitor to this country, and that's not a story that they want out.
All right, we've run out of time, Andrew. Would you like to tell the viewers where they can find you and your book online?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Yeah, do you want to tell the viewers where they can find you and your book online?
How can they find my book online? It's on Amazon, and I think you've kindly put some details up of my various websites. So that would be great. And I mean, I'd be very interested to hear what people make of it.
All right, thank you for coming on, and thank you for watching, viewers. All of Andrew's links will be below this video, and if you want to check the book out, it is available worldwide on Amazon. So thank you, Andrew. You have a good night.
Thanks a lot. Okay, bye-bye.
All right, take care. Bye-bye. Bye.